Welcome to class number 2. The title for this class is Enumerated versus Unlimited Power. What we want to talk about today is what it is our founding fathers gave us with the U.S. Constitution. Was it designed to empower a federal government that has limitless power, or one that was limited to few powers, and what the original intent of the Constitution was? So to begin with, I want to start off with a quote here from Thomas Jefferson, where he declares what his view on this question really was. Congress has not unlimited powers, but only those specifically enumerated. Now the question I would ask is, if they're specifically enumerated, where would those be enumerated? Kind of an obvious question. That would be in the U.S. Constitution. That would be where we would look for that specific enumeration. Now, I want to talk about this concept first before we go much deeper, the concept of enumerated powers. What does the word enumerated mean? Well, it comes from the same root word as number does. Numbered, specifically listed, that means that these powers aren't just something that's implied or vague, they are specific. There's a list of them we can find in the Constitution, which we'll be spending some time on. I want to use an analogy today, though. Some of you have probably had the experience of taking a car into the auto shop. Let's say you take your car into the auto shop to have the brake pads changed, and when you come back the next day to pick up your car, you can't find your car. They assure you it's up in the northwest corner of the parking lot and you can't find it. Finally, they lead you over and, oh no, this is not my car was blue. They said, well, we noticed you had a number of chips in the paint and we took the liberty to repaint your car for you. Now it's red. And not only that, you notice on closer inspection you have a new car stereo system, a very nice, expensive one, but however your bill reflects all of this as well. And yet further inspection reveals that your brake pads were never changed. The problem is you made the mistake of taking your car to the U.S. Congress auto shop because, like Congress today, this auto shop is taking upon themselves numbers of powers that we never gave them. And then they're also neglecting the things they're supposed to be doing for us. If you then said to your auto mechanic, what gave you the idea that you could do this to my car? And they respond, well, you never said we couldn't. Does that fly? Clearly not. We all understand that when you take your car into the auto shop, you fill out a work order, please change brake pads. That is an enumerated power list. Anything on the list they can do, and if while they're changing your brake pads, they notice that your wheel bearings are going out. Do they just change out your wheel bearings? Of course not. They give you a call. Say, we noticed this. Would you like to grant us a new enumerated power? That's not the way they say it, but that is what they're asking. And if you approve them to change out your wheel bearings as well, that's on their list now of enumerated powers. The same thing works for Congress. If it's on the list, they can do it. If it's not on the list, but they feel it's necessary, they can certainly request to the people, please grant an amendment to the Constitution granting new power. But otherwise, if it's not on the list, they don't have the power. Now, can you imagine for a moment if we were to trim back the federal budget to fit within those enumerated powers? That'd mean we'd trim the federal budget by 80%. Do you think we could balance the budget? I think we could quite easily balance the budget and have a surplus and do something we haven't done for many years. That means pay off the national debt. That's really what we need to be doing, and I think this is the only way we could ever do so, is if we were to get our federal government to rein itself back in, or we rein it in, to fit within the bounds prescribed by the Constitution. Now, I want to draw your attention to this handout called U.S. Constitution Roadmap. It's like a table of contents. The legislative department is the entire first page, Article 1. As you turn over to the back side, you see Article 2, the executive department, Article 3, judicial department. Notice how much smaller those are than the powers of Congress. Congress takes up the entire half of this whole document. And that's about how it works out in the U.S. Constitution as well. The section that describes how Congress shall function and what their powers are and their limits and so on is roughly half of the U.S. Constitution, which gives you an idea of who of the three branches has the most power. That is Congress. And we'll illustrate that a little bit later on in today's lecture. The next thing I want to point out is on this front side, the largest section in Article 1 is this white one. Notice how it goes Article 1, and then there's Section 8, which is Congress, powers granted to Congress. And then in Section 8, there's 18 clauses. Article, section, and clause is the way the Constitution is laid out. It's very much like in the Bible where you have book, like the book of Matthew, and then chapter 1 and verse 1. Article, section, and clause is very much like book, chapter, and verse. Now this largest section is the list of powers. This is the enumerated powers of Congress in Section 8. That's the list of powers that they can legislate on. They can make laws on any of the things on these 18 clauses, and only that. And if it's not on that list, they don't have the power. Now, in the U.S. Constitution itself, the very first line after the preamble, if you have your pocket Constitution with you, in this version it's on page 11. Right after the preamble, we find Article 1, Section 1, and Clause 1. The very first thing it defines is this: all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress. What's legislative power? Legislative power is lawmaking. Lawmaking power. So all power to make laws is given to whom? Go ahead. Congress. All power to make laws given to Congress. Now here's your quiz. If any of you are good at math, you may remember those if-then questions. If all legislative power is in Congress, then how much power is left over for the president to legislate, to write new laws? None. You're sure about that? Does he ever legislate? Unfortunately, yes. Frequently. And we're not just talking about our current president, but virtually every president in my lifetime, and probably quite a long time before, have legislated without Congress being involved. They write an executive order and sign it, and this is a new law. That violates the very first line after the preamble of the Constitution. For the president to write law himself, he's taking the power of one of the other two branches, which was clearly defined for Congress and Congress only. That's a usurpation of power. Now, again, this if-then question, the next one is, if all legislative power is in Congress, how much legislative power is left to the Supreme Court? None? You're sure? Do they ever legislate? Yes. Again, unfortunately, they do. A classic example is Roe versus Wade, which hundreds of years of history were suddenly diverted in a different direction by a ruling of the Supreme Court. And as we're told today, Roe versus Wade, legalizing abortion, is settled law. If Roe versus Wade is settled law, who wrote the law? It wasn't the legislature, it wasn't Congress, was it? It was the Supreme Court. So in that way, that clearly violates the very first line of the Constitution. If we just followed this much of the Constitution, a major portion of what's going on in our nation would stop, because the president is legislating quite actively, as is the Supreme Court. This would rein in a good portion of that. Now, the next part I want to focus on is the phrase herein granted. All legislative powers herein granted. The point is, all the legislative powers that were herein granted in that part we just covered, Article 1, Section 8, clauses 1 through 18, that's where it is herein granted. And any that is not herein granted, well then the 10th Amendment applies. The powers that are not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. What does that mean? If it's not on this list, that power does not belong to the federal. It belongs to either the states or to the people. Now, in some cases, some things are prohibited to the states. You'll find that primarily in Article 1, Section 10. There's a list. It says, no state shall, no state shall, no state shall, all throughout Article 1, Section 10. We'll go into some of those a little bit later in Lecture 3 in particular, no state shall section. So some things, it's not appropriate for the federal nor the state governments to be doing. Some powers are reserved only to the people. Some things are not appropriate for government to be involved in at all. That is probably the simplest description of constitutionalism 101 I could give you. Only Congress can legislate. Congress can only legislate on those enumerated powers found in Article 1, Section 8. and anything else is a power left to the states or to the people. If everyone understood that much of what our federal government's involved in, it would not be. So considering the fact that our federal government has stepped far beyond the bounds prescribed by the Constitution, it's become popular lately. Many states have started pushing forward for nullification type bills. What nullification is simply on a state level is when a state stands up and says, we do not recognize the authority of the federal government to legislate in this area. It's not in their jurisdiction, therefore we are not going along with it. Very simple concept. But there's been a lot of concern about this. The media has certainly done their share of warning people against it. And I'd say probably one of the most common excuses or reasons for fearing nullification was expressed by a governor of one of the western states recently when he said this: we can't have the states picking and choosing which laws they want to obey. That would lead to anarchy. And you know, there is some truth to that. I have to admit, if the states were simply to pick and choose which laws they like that come from the federal government, then the federal really has no real power. From lecture number 1, you might remember there was a chart on the screen where it showed kind of a big wedge. Over on this side, 0% government, and on the far other side is 100% government. And 0% government being anarchy, 100% government being any form of a totalitarian state with all power in the government. And that our U.S. Constitution was really the balance between those two. That too little government leads to chaos, but too much government causes problems as well. We want to make the government strong enough to protect our rights, but not strong enough to abuse us in the process. Now, prior to the U.S. Constitution, we were living under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation, they concluded, were too close to this side of anarchy. They didn't have enough real power to do the jobs we gave them to do. For example, we gave our Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, the responsibility to raise an army to fight for our independence from Great Britain. And yet they had no power to tax. They could request tax money from the states, but they couldn't enforce it. And because of that, that alone, among many other reasons, but that alone nearly cost us the war, because they couldn't raise the money to fund the war. And what they finally resorted to was just printing the money, print more and more of the continental dollars. And we'll talk about that a little in lecture 3 as well. But you can see the problem. If the federal has no real power and the states can truly pick and choose, yes, that would be a problem. And yet on the other end of the spectrum, are the states required to go along with anything the federal government says no matter what? If that were the case, then we truly have an unlimited government. Whether they're within their bounds of the Constitution or not, we go to the other end of that spectrum, we end up in tyranny. And so, where do we draw the line? Is there a clear line we can draw between what is appropriate for the states to go along with whether they like it or not, and what is appropriate for them to nullify? And of course, I would say yes, the answer is the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is very clear and defining on what those laws can be and what they cannot be. There is one other excuse that I see for staying away from nullification, and that is, in the last legislative session, we had a state legislator who proposed a number of nullification-type bills, saying the federal government has no authority in this realm, so we will not be observing this law, or something of that nature. And of course, he portrayed himself as a strong constitutionalist. And the national media picked this up. He got national attention for it. And they said, apparently his love for the Constitution does not extend to the supremacy clause. So that's the other one, is the supremacy clause. It's found in Article 6, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And here's what they want you to believe it says. This is not what it says. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be passed by Congress, that's the part that they don't want you to know what it really says, shall be the supreme law of the land. So what this is implying is any law that's passed by Congress is the supreme law of the land, regardless of whether or not it's on the list of enumerated powers. If they pass it, it's constitutional and supreme. But a simple reading of the Constitution resolves this question. Because Article 6, Clause 2 doesn't say that. It says this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof. shall be the supreme law of the land. Made in pursuance thereof. And by the way, on your class handout, that is answer to question number 1. There's a fill in the blank. Made in pursuance thereof is your first answer. Now, what does that mean? Made in pursuance thereof, thereof meaning referring back to the Constitution. Pursuance of the Constitution. What does it mean to pursue? To follow? Closely follow? So to have a law that is made in pursuance of the Constitution literally means that that law is in following or in keeping with the Constitution, the powers granted by the Constitution. Now, what does this imply about laws that are not made in pursuance thereof? If laws made in pursuance of the Constitution are supreme, then laws not made in pursuance are not supreme, right? In fact, Marbury versus Madison, a Supreme Court ruling, declared all laws which are repugnant, in conflict with the Constitution, are null and void. They're not laws at all. So this is directly contrary to what the media was saying about this state legislator. Apparently his love for the Constitution does extend to the Supremacy Clause because only those laws made in pursuance thereof are supreme. And all other laws are not laws at all. Now this brings us to the oath of office. All of our state legislators and governors swear an oath of office to what? Well, this seems to be what so many of them think they have sworn. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will be subject and subservient to the federal government, and that I will support and defend all laws passed by Congress or the Supreme Court or the President, never questioning their authority to legislate in all matters whatsoever. That seems to be what they feel like they're supposed to be doing. Whatever the federal government does, we must comply with. That's not what their oath said. The oath of office, whether it's a federal oath or a state oath or whatever, all elected officials and people appointed to various positions of government, even our military, police, sheriffs, and so on, they're required to swear an oath, something of this nature. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, it's those domestic ones in particular that I'm concerned about. Ancient Rome and the ancient Roman Republic never fell to an external power until they first crumbled internally. And we will be the same. And so it's those domestic ones first that we need to worry about. Now, a simple test. I always like to make things as simple as possible. If you want to understand what really is constitutional and what is not, when someone's bringing forth an interpretation of here's what the Constitution means, remember this simple test that I'm about to give you. It comes from 2 quotes from our founding fathers. First, James Madison in Federalist number 45. Now, the Federalist Papers, as a quick side note, was a list of 85 letters to the editor, really, written by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. These letters were written to the papers of the state of New York to help the people of New York understand this Constitution that was being proposed, to encourage them to go along with it and encourage their state to ratify it. So the Federalist Papers is probably the greatest single source of what was the original intent of the Constitution. It's the greatest authority on that topic. Now, Federalist number 45, James Madison points out, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are vague, undefined. No, few and defined. Just the opposite of vague. They're few and they are defined. That means they're clear. The other quote here from Thomas Jefferson says, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, not longer susceptible of any definition. The 2 phrases I want you to remember now are few and defined and boundless fields of power. That's the test. This interpretation that someone's sharing with you, this is what the Constitution means. By that interpretation, can we justify boundless fields of power? Or by that interpretation, is that a narrow, few, and defined understanding of the powers? And we'll repeat this test a few times today. So that's where we are today. I want you to always remember this Enumerated powers versus a boundless field of power. Few and defined or boundless powers. That's our simple test we'll be applying to the Constitution. Now, contrary to this, the Attorney General between 1941 and 1945, a man by the name of Francis Biddle, he gives us his interpretation of how to interpret the Constitution. The government of the United States can do anything not specifically prohibited by the Constitution. Does that sound like few and defined or boundless power? Boundless power. That sounds like our auto mechanic, doesn't it? How big would the work order have to be when you take your car in to list everything you don't want them to do specifically? Please don't change my left or right headlights. Please don't change the dome light. Please don't change out the fourth lug nut on the front right wheel. And the work order would have to be huge. In the same way, how big would the Constitution have to be if we listed what they could not do rather than the few powers we were actually giving them? It wouldn't be this size, I tell you that. It would probably be a lot more like the size of most of the bills they're passing today, where it takes reams of paper to print it. And no one would know what it said, and no one would be able to read it. Wisely, they chose to simply list those few powers you do have, and if it's not on the list, you can't do it. So he's clearly reading the Constitution in reverse. And of course, Congressman Pete Stark, just to bring things to modern day, this concept, this idea still persists. In this country, the federal government can do pretty much whatever it wants to. Yet again, boundless or few and defined. That's clearly boundless power, isn't it? Now, I want to bring things down to a very simple description. There's really 5 places in the Constitution that are frequently exploited and stretched beyond their original intent to find unlimited power. The first one we've already covered, that being the Supremacy Clause. Whatever is passed by Congress is supreme and you must comply. The other 4 consist of the General Welfare Clause. You've probably heard that used before. Found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. We'll go into that one next. But the rest of the list, number 3 is the Necessary and Proper Clause. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Frequently also known as the Elastic Clause, because this one you can just stretch to fit any power you could imagine into it. Or also the Implied Powers Clause, it's also known as. Number 4, the Interstate Commerce Clause. This one's had a fair amount of popularity and publicity lately, because it's the one that our national health care law is justified by, we're told. This is why they can do this new law. Found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. We'll go into that one as well, and then we'll conclude with treaty law. So let's start with number 2 now, the General Welfare Clause. Here's what it does say. Congress shall have power, and then the ... is various ways of raising money. So Congress shall have power to raise money to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare. That's the only 3 things Congress can spend money on: pay debts, provide for the common defense, and general welfare. Now that has been taken to mean, especially the general welfare, that Congress can do anything it wants to as long as it's for the general good. Not at all what was originally intended. We'll demonstrate that. First of all, James Madison, again, declares if Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, then the government is no longer a limited one. He's using our same test, isn't he? Is this limited government few and defined or boundless fields of power? He's saying if that's the interpretation, we're talking about boundless power. We do not have limited government. And yet that is the popular understanding of that clause today, as wrong as it may be. Thomas Jefferson again points out, Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated. Specifically enumerated? The powers of general welfare are specifically enumerated? Well, yes, they are. In fact, that's about half of what's in Article 1, Section 8. I'll show you that in just a moment. One more quote from James Madison, and then we'll get into it. He says, "Nothing is more natural nor common than to first use a general phrase and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars." In other words, to introduce your topic, such as I'm writing a research paper on trees. I start off with the statement, the general phrase, trees are good. Then I'll recite some particulars such as trees are good for shade, Trees are good for wood. Trees are good for the environment, for animals to live in. Trees are good for helping have more oxygen in the air, and so on. Those are the recital particulars. Start with a general phrase and then give the specifics afterwards. That's exactly how Article 1, Section 8 is written. It starts off with, at the top, Clause 1, the very first line in Article 1, Section 8. If you want to follow along, this is on page 17 in your pocket Constitution. It starts off with, the Congress shall have power to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare. And then the next 9 clauses borrow money, regulate commerce, establish rules of naturalization and laws on bankruptcies, coin money, punish counterfeiting, establish post offices, post roads, promote science and useful arts by protecting exclusive right, that being like patents and that type of thing, constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, and then you jump all the way to the very end, 17, which is the second to last, which is the power to control land for limited purposes. Those are general welfare powers. And the reason I categorize these ones as general welfare is because everything else in Article 1, Section 8 is common defense. That's the 2 categories listed at the beginning, isn't it? To provide for the common defense and general welfare. That's our general phrase at the top, common defense and general welfare. And then here's the specific powers of common defense on this side and general welfare on that side. But all the powers fall into one of these 2 categories. Now, a year or so ago, I was grilling a congressman on his voting record. I like to do that type of thing myself. Asking him, where in the Constitution did you feel you had the authority granted to take our tax dollars and give it away to the governments of foreign nations, what's known as foreign aid? And I don't care what government we're talking about, where in the Constitution is it granted? And he said, well, that would depend on which foreign aid. In some cases, it would be under the General Welfare Clause, and some of it would be under the Common Defense Clause. My response to him was, well, I understand very well, I'm very familiar with the general welfare powers. They are specifically listed in clauses 2 through 9 and 17. Which one of those are you talking about? And while we're on the topic, the common defense powers, clauses 10 through 16, are specifically enumerated. Which one of those do you feel grants the power for foreign aid? This was on Facebook where he was campaigning for re-election. It was his campaign page. He deleted my question and then blocked me from asking any further questions. I guess he didn't like the direction this was going. But you see the point. You can't use the Common Defense Clause or the General Welfare Clause as an excuse for a power if it's not listed in the specifics thereafter. That is the general welfare powers. This is the common defense powers. It's very clear. And that is all that the common defense or general welfare grants. Now, the next one, excuse number 3, the elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause. Here's what it does say. The Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. A few years ago, a friend of mine used this one with me. I was telling him his U.S. Senator that he loves so much doesn't tend to follow the Constitution very well. And he asked for some specifics. I gave him some. He says, oh, well, that's under the necessary and proper clause. Would you mind reading that with me, I say? Sure, and this is what he read. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. And that sounds like few and defined powers or boundless. That does sound pretty boundless, and that is what it says. Do we have a problem here? Well, no. If you read it in context, the only problem is we didn't finish reading. In fact, if anyone ever uses this one with you, just ask them to read the next 7 words. You can read on if you'd like, but the next 7 words really clarify it because it says, for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What is that talking about? Congress has power to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Let me show you where this appears in the Constitution, right here at the bottom. You have Article 1, Section 8, the heading up there, the specific powers of general welfare, common defense, and then the conclusion, the necessary and proper clause. And it says they have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, these powers that came before it. It's referring to this list of powers, isn't it? So if that's referring to this list of powers, either common defense powers or general welfare powers, does that give any new power? It doesn't. It clearly doesn't. In fact, my friend, when I shared this with him, would you mind reading the next 7 words? He read that and said, oh. And that was it. Let's go on to a new topic. And I think that's all we need to do on this particular excuse. You just read it in context. It resolves that for you very nicely. So the next one, and this one's a big one, the Interstate Commerce Clause. You have to realize that the Interstate Commerce Clause is actually part of a larger clause here. This is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, and it says, the Congress shall have power to, as a quick side note for a moment, as you read through the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, you'll notice every one of those clauses begins with the word to do this, and then to do that, to do this, to do that. All of those, just insert in your mind, the Congress shall have power to do each of those in Article 1, Section 8. So clause number 3, Congress shall have power to, and then we jump down to clause 3, regulate commerce. And then it talks about 3 areas they can regulate commerce. You can regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. That's a power of commerce. I'd really call it the Commerce Clause, which specifies 3 different areas. But it's this one right here that they refer to as the Interstate Commerce Clause, commerce among the several states. And from that little phrase, I'm amazed what they've created. Back in the late 1930s, Congress decided that by this Interstate Commerce Clause, they have the power to regulate anything that happens to be commerce between states. So much so that they decided, we're going to help our farmers out because they're struggling. We want the farmers to be able to make a good living wage without having to work so long and hard. So what they ended up doing was passed a law that farmers cannot raise more than a certain number of tons of grain. They limited the amount of grain that farmers were allowed by federal law to raise. And by 1942, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case known as Wickard versus Filburn, where Farmer Filburn was being tried for raising more grain than allowed by federal law. And in his defense, he said, yes, I did raise that amount of grain, but I was not engaging in interstate commerce, so I'm not subject to this limitation. They said, well, why do you figure that? Well, I wasn't engaging in commerce at all. I was raising the grain for my own use and to feed my animals. I never sold it. It wasn't commerce. It wasn't intercity commerce, let alone interstate commerce. And they said, yes, it was. How do you figure? Because if you had not raised the grain, but instead had to purchase it on the interstate commerce market, you would affect the price of grain. By raising grain and not purchasing, you're also affecting interstate commerce. By not purchasing, you're affecting interstate commerce. Astounding. That's quite a stretch, but again, let's take it back to our simple test. By this interpretation, by not participating in commerce, you're affecting commerce. What can Congress not regulate? If I choose to raise a garden in my backyard and partially feed my family from it, I'm engaging in less commerce because I'm not buying as much food from the store. By that justification, then, Congress can regulate my garden in my backyard and tell me what I can and cannot grow and how much. Correct? What if I were to do some work on my own home? I want to repaint my house, for example. I'm not engaging in commerce because I'm not hiring a contractor to do it. So therefore, my not hiring can be subject to congressional control as well. And they can regulate whether or not I get to paint my own house or if I have to hire someone to do it. And some countries in Europe do that very thing today. Last example, if I choose to have children or not have children or have many children or few, all of those will affect my buying, my purchasing on the interstate commerce market. By this justification, could Congress then tell me how many children I can have or not? Would any government be so bold as to tell you how many children you can have? I guess that's already happened in other countries as well. And by this justification, they could do the same thing here, under the Commerce Clause. Definitely not few and defined powers. That's unlimited government, without a doubt. But it is that same justification that is used today to justify things like our new national health care law, which is being debated whether or not it's constitutional. I tell you today clearly there's no doubt it is not authorized by those few enumerated powers of the Constitution. But just to show you what this does mean, what does this commerce power have to do with? What is the few and defined powers? Chief Justice John Marshall gives us a nice, clear description of it. He says, this power of regulation of commerce, must carry the same meaning throughout the sentence. What's he saying? Let's go back to it now. This power to regulate commerce is the same power whether it's with foreign nations or whether it's among the several states. It's the same power. Can Congress tell France, for example, that your farmers cannot raise more than a certain amount of grain? Of course not. So this power to regulate commerce with France cannot do that, then the power to regulate commerce among the states cannot do that either. Congress has no such power over foreign nations. Then they don't have the power over the states either. If it is truly the same power, and one of the things that John Marshall points out is that unless there is somewhere in the Constitution that more clearly defines that power, they are exactly the same power. Is there anywhere in the Constitution that differentiates between the power over the states here and the power over foreign nations? The answer is there is actually one place that does clarify the power. That would be found in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 5. In Article 1, Section 9, Clause 5 limits the power that Congress has over the states. Found on page 19 here, and it says, "No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state." So it's saying that Congress does not have the power to allow any taxes or duties on trade between the states. What power do they have with foreign nations? That's the only power they have with foreign nations. They can't tell France what they can do and what they can't do with their commerce. All they can do is put a tariff or impost or duty, meaning product coming from France, 10% tariff as it crosses our border. That's the only power that Congress has over foreign trade. And what it says here in Article 1, Section 9 is that power is forbidden between the states. The only thing they can do with foreign countries, they cannot do with the states. In fact, it's their duty to make sure that there are no tariffs between the states. Now, the reason they did that was prior to the U.S. Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were heavy tariffs between the states. If I wanted to transport my goods from, say, up in Rhode Island down through Massachusetts to some of the southern states, Massachusetts especially was guilty of this. They charged huge tariffs for anything crossing through their state. So much so that it was cheaper to buy products from Great Britain than it was from each other, because we put such heavy duties and tariffs on each other. And so that was the vision here in Article 1, Section 9, was to prohibit such things. So today we're taught that this power of commerce, power over the states, is an unlimited power. Originally it was actually virtually no power. The only power that was there was preventing tariffs. And with the foreign nations, they could apply tariffs. Now, just to prove that I'm not making this up, President James Monroe said exactly the same thing in 1822. He says, "A power then to impose such duties and imposts in regard to foreign nations and to prevent any on the trade between the states was the only power granted." You'll find that's one of the answers on your sheet here. Number 7, a power then to impose such duties and imposts and to prevent any on the trade between the states. That's the entire sum of the power of Commerce Clause, interstate and international commerce. The last one, treaty law. I've seen many emails about Secretary of State Hillary Clinton working on a treaty that would ban small arms from we the people owning them. Trying to create some kind of a gun ban with the United Nations and passing it as a treaty. And we're told that if the President and 2/3 of the Senate passed this treaty, it would override the Constitution. Now again, I'm sorry, but I have a hard time believing that one. Here's what the treaty clause says. This is actually part of the supremacy clause in Article 6, Clause 2. It says, this Constitution and all treaties made, or which shall be made. And then you want to skip over this part because if you read it, you might understand it. And then shall be the supreme law of the land. And that's what we're told the treaty law is about. Whatever is passed as a treaty is supreme, period. And you're probably coming to recognize my pattern here. The part that's left out is the part that helps you understand the true meaning. What it says there is, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be supreme. Under the authority, what authority? Where is this authority granted? Oh yes, in the Constitution, that's right. So, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States. Now you notice this one was worded a little bit different than the Supremacy Clause one, which said made in pursuance thereof. And the question's been raised sometimes in my classes, so why did they not just simply say in pursuance thereof? At this time, they already had on the books a number of treaties that were made not under the authority of the Constitution, but under the authority of the Articles of Confederation. And they didn't want this to strike down those treaties. This recognizes the authority that they were made under at the time. Those treaties that were made under the Articles of Confederation was the authority of the United States at that time. Once the Constitution was adopted, all new treaties must comply with the new authority, which is the Constitution. Now again, I'm not making such things up. I want to demonstrate to you now a couple different places that show what the treaty law really means. First of all, another great quote, Thomas Jefferson says, I say the same as to the opinion of those who consider the grant of the treaty-making power as boundless. If it is, then we have no Constitution. If the President and the Senate, with a two-thirds majority, can override anything in the Constitution with a treaty, then we don't have a Constitution. Now the next place I want to go to is a Supreme Court ruling in 1957 known as Reed versus Covert. And in this one, here's a portion of it. It says, it would be manifestly contrary to, and then it lists three different things. It would be manifestly contrary to the objectives of those who created the Constitution, as well as those who were responsible for the Bill of Rights, and then lastly, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition. Pretty strong words. This is completely out of the question of anything we've ever done constitutionally, those who wrote the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and our entire history, to do what? To construe Article 6, the treaty power, as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement, and here's the key phrase, without observing constitutional prohibitions. Treaties are subject to prohibitions of power of the Constitution. In other words, if Congress has no authority to restrict our right to bear arms, then they cannot do so with a treaty. Beautiful Supreme Court ruling. Every once in a while, even a blind squirrel finds a nut. The Supreme Court got it right. Today, we have the federal government doing many things clearly outside the bounds of their power, such as, where's the power for foreign aid, federal housing programs, or education? There should be no Department of Education. Transportation, in particular the TSA, has had a lot of press, for good reason. Department of Energy, not authorized by the Constitution either. What about federal government taking from the states and the people vast areas of land to designate as wilderness areas? They're not given that power either. Wildlife, that's not within the jurisdiction of the federal government. And of course, health care. Unfortunately, this list could be far larger of things they are doing that they shouldn't be. But we don't have the time to go into all of that. But so often I get asked the question, but some of these things the federal government's doing that are not on your list here are so needed. It's for a good cause. We just have to do good in this Department of Education and helping our children have good educations or whatever. Whether we could debate back and forth whether or not they're even accomplishing that. But when we talk about this, it's for a good cause, so therefore we need to ignore the Constitution. George Washington, in his farewell address in 1796, gave us a warning on this topic. He said, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of constitutional powers, the way we set up the Constitution, is in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Again, we let them take one step outside the bounds of the Constitution, they now have boundless fields of power. There's no logical place to rein them in. So, remember the brake pads that weren't changed out on the car. There are many duties Congress has given that they are not fulfilling today. They should never allow our troops to go to war and fund a war unless they have actually debated and declared a war. We'll talk about that in Lecture 4. They need to also fulfill their duty to repel an invasion. They're only supposed to raise armies, not maintain an army on an ongoing basis, which is interesting. We'll talk about that in Lecture 4 as well. Power to coin money we'll talk about next time in Lecture 3, which they're not fulfilling that duty. They're supposed to organize state militia, and what we have today in Lecture 4 will clearly define the difference between what we do have and what the constitutional militias are supposed to be. Very different. Impeachment of judges. They do that occasionally, but I can tell you there are many judges that need to be impeached. One particular one recently, who Ruth Bader Ginsburg declared, "I really look more to international law than I do to the U.S. Constitution for my rulings." She then admitted she probably violated her oath of office in the process. Yes, you did, and yes, you should be impeached. And yet we're told judges are appointed for life. That's not what the Constitution says. It doesn't give any term of limit of how long they can serve, but it does say during times of good behavior. Good behavior. And if not, then they should be impeached. Well, I would say that openly admitting you're violating your oath of office is not good behavior, if ever there was bad behavior. And this is the final one that so many of our elected officials are ignoring, is their duty to uphold their oath of office, to actually follow the limits of power of the Constitution. The only way we can get back to the Constitution then, the power is really in us and our states. It's up to the states and the people to rein in the federal government. James Madison points out in Federalist number 44, there's a reason why our state-level officials are required to swear an oath of office not just to their state constitution, but also to the federal constitution. At the end of Federalist 44, he addresses this question. In his answer, he says, the members and officers of the state governments will have the essential agency in giving effect to the Constitution, making it effective. Is the Constitution today effective in reining in our federal government? I'm afraid not. And if that's the case, who's to blame? Primarily, it's our state-level officials, but secondarily, it's we the people not holding them accountable for holding the federal government accountable. And that's the way the power process works. That's the way the Constitution was formed. We the people empowered the states. The states then formed the Constitution. And that's the same way we rein it in. So nullification is the topic that we started off with. And that's really where we need to conclude then. To dispel the myths, nullification is not some kind of a seditious act or rebellion or treason against the federal government. It's not lawlessness. We're not seceding from the Union. It's not even civil disobedience. It's actually obeying the law. It's upholding the Constitution. When our state-level officials, our governors, our state legislators, our sheriffs, and so on, are faced with a decision, do I follow the federal government or do I follow the Constitution? Which one did they swear an oath to? Clearly, it was the Constitution. The only way we can see this happen then is if our state-level officials will understand and apply this. Thomas Jefferson tells us that the several states who formed the instrument of the Constitution have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction, and a nullification by those sovereignties, the states, of unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. If this were not the case, he tells us, without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise the right of judgment for them. Who are we told today has the right to judge if something is constitutional or not? Only the Supreme Court. Well, that would put us under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, according to Jefferson, of the Supreme Court. And that is partially where we are already today. So what we need in order to make this work is governors, first and foremost, who are willing to stand by their oath of office, who understand the importance of giving effect to the Constitution. And then a majority of state legislators who understand and will back him on that. It doesn't take every state legislator. But even one governor isn't really enough. If you have one state that stands up to the federal government, they generally are bullied into submission. A classic example of this was the Real ID Act of 2005, which was the establishment of a national ID card, which was very invasive into personal information that they were wanting to collect on a national database. Many states were very opposed to it. Here in Montana, where I'm from, our own state legislature passed a bill saying we will not, under any circumstances, implement the Real ID Act. And our governor signed it. And shortly we found that we were standing with 12 states, standing together. And with that, the federal government backed down and said, we'll give you some more time to implement this. By the time that next deadline came up, 28 states were standing together saying, we will not implement this. And they've since put it to the back burner. Now they're trying to implement it piecemeal through our Department of Motor Vehicles, but that's another matter. The point is, we stopped that bad law by states standing together. And that's the only way that we can truly rein in the federal government, is first with the states, and then secondarily, we need to replace Congress with those that will stand by their oath of office as well. And ultimately, the responsibility for all of that does rest with us, with we the people. The only reason they get away with what they are right now, how many people understand what we've covered today? If you were to do a survey around your community, how many people could tell you what the powers are and are not under the general welfare, under the Commerce Clause, and so on? How many people in Washington could? I find even there, they're often simply just ignorant of it. Some of them do willfully disobey it, but I think many of them are just ignorant of their limits of power. And if this becomes common knowledge again, then we the people can rein in our government back to what they're actually supposed to be doing, preserving our liberty and reining in the federal budget, at least 80% eventually. So with that will conclude our lecture on the Constitution, enumerated versus unlimited power. And in the next lecture, we'll go into some of the specifics of the power, monetary power, and further lectures on the war powers in lecture number 4. Thank you for joining us today.